than our enslavement that's pathetically portrayed in movies such as Roots and 12 Years a Slave. For example, the Gullah Geechee people living along the Sea Islands in South Carolina and Georgia fled their enslavers and established numerous independent settlements throughout Florida. And I'm not talking about that dilapidated Spanish-controlled town called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose that revisionist historians and white supremacists falsely prop up as the place where blacks fled to and lived happy and free. Were it not for the unprovoked, ungodly, and relentless pursuits of one of their greatest nemesis, Andrew Jackson, and Presidents Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe, the Gullah Geechee people would have reestablished Florida as an
when the Gullah beat the U.S. in back-to-back wars. The Gullah won 3 wars against the United States in the 1800s. See, what had happened was, the U.S. declared itself independent in 1776. That's when the states went from being colonies of Britain to becoming the United States of America. And it already had 13 colonies, but they were hungry for more. Problem was, Spain owned Florida and was not about to give it up so easy. They put word out that if black folk made their way to Florida from the Low Country, they'd be free from slavery. Now, Spain wasn't being righteous. They just figured that black folk would be their bodyguards. Florida was nothing but swamps and mosquitoes. Folk were catching malaria out there. It was hard living. But the Gullah Geechee who run away there preferred that than plantations. And they made the land livable, started families and intermingled cultures with Native Americans. White folks called them Seminoles, meaning wild or untamed. The more melanated ones were called Black Seminoles. Note, runaway slaves who established their own land and communities were known as Maroons. They were self-emancipated, meaning they freed their damn selves. There were Maroon communities in Virginia, North Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, Nova Scotia, which is in Canada, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba, Panama, Brazil, etc. So when I say we all cousins, y'all, I mean that. In 1818, Andrew Jackson, who was then an army general, this was before he became president, he led the army to claim and colonize Florida. The Gullah and the Native Americans, aka the Seminoles, fought him and won. About 200 Black Seminoles, according to Rosalind Howard's book called Black Seminoles in the Bahamas, they dipped from Florida to Andros Island in the Bahamas between 1821 and 1837. And that's because they didn't want to risk being enslaved again. An Army general in 1826 wrote about the Black Seminoles in Florida, and this is what he said. We found the Negroes in possession of large fields of the finest land, producing large crops of corn, beans, melons, pumpkins, and other esculent vegetables. They are chiefly runaway slaves from Georgia who have put themselves under the protection of the McCanopy. 1818 actually wasn't the first time the U.S. tried to fight them. They lost so fast and so bad that they called the first couple times skirmishes instead of wars. It's like they were saying, we wasn't ready yet, so those don't count. The U.S. intentionally called them Indian Wars because they feared calling them Negro Wars would lead to slave riots. But they knew. In a letter to Jackson, Army General Thomas Jessup wrote, "This, you may be assured, is a Negro, not an Indian war. And if it be not speedily put down, the South will feel the effects of it on their slave population before the end of the next season." Now, Andrew Jackson became president in 1829 and signed the Indian Removal Act the following year. As a slave owner himself, he wanted to push the Native Americans out west and expand the Cotton Kingdom into Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, etc. George Washington figured the best way to deal with the Native Americans was to quote-unquote civilize them. The same way that Gullah Geechee was shamed into living and speaking more American than African, the Native Americans went through the same thing. But Andrew Jackson wasn't into civilizing. He proudly wore the nickname Indian Killer. By 1836, he snatched all those southern states except Florida. The Seminoles weren't giving up the Pride land easy. Jackson waged war against them again in 1835 and lost again. In 1842, the U.S. finally beat them and forced them out of Florida and onto the Trail of Tears into Oklahoma. Some stayed there, others went to Texas, and a good bit of them went to Mexico. Again, we all cousins. In 1845, Florida became the 27th state to join the USA. After the Second Seminole War, the U.S. decided to chill for a second and leave the remaining Seminoles in Florida alone. Then the president at the time, Franklin Pierce, he decided to get the rest of Florida too. So the third war popped off. But the U.S. ended up just paying the rest of the Seminoles to leave. They ain't want it. They ain't want no smoke. In 1870, the U.S., recognizing that the Seminoles were hella strong and organized in war, invited them to join the U.S. Army. They were called the Seminole Negro Indian Scouts. In 1978, historians interviewed remaining scouts in Brackettville, Texas, and discovered that many of them still spoke Gullah and ate Gullah dishes.
Slavery and South Carolina are synonymous, obviously. But one of the lines that connects the dots might come from a source you wouldn't expect. The following quote is from the Jewish Virtual Library. The Jewish temples, the Babylonian exile, 597 to 538 BCE. Quote, the salient feature of the exile, however, was that the Jews were settled in a single place by Nebuchadnezzar. While the Assyrian deportation of the Israelites in 722 BC resulted in the complete disappearance of the Israelites, the deported Jews formed their own community in Babylon and retained their religion, practices, and philosophies. Some, it was seen, adopted the Chaldean religion, for they named their offspring after Chaldean gods. But for the most part, the community remained united in its common faith of Yahweh. They called themselves the Gullah, exiles, or B'nai Gullah, the children of the exiles. And within the crucible of despair and hopelessness, they forged a new national identity and a new religion. So the Jewish Virtual Library speaks of the exiles of the tribe of Judah, that they called themselves Gullah, G-O-L-A, also spelled Gala or Gullah. So who are the Gullah people, or the exiles of Judah? The Gullah people are descendants of enslaved Africans of various ethnic groups who live in the Lowcountry region of the U.S., in the states of Georgia and South Carolina, both in the coastal plain and the Sea Islands. They developed a Creole language, the Gullah language, and a culture rich in African influences that make them distinctive among African Americans. So let's see what the encyclopedia has to say about the Gullah people. The origin of the word Gullah is unclear. Some scholars suggest it may be cognate with the word Angola, where the ancestors of some of the Gullah people likely originated. They created a new culture synthesized from that of various African peoples brought into Charleston and South Carolina. Some scholars have suggested that it may come from the name of the Gullah, an ethnic group living in the border area between present-day Sierra Leone and Liberia in West Africa. The Gullah language is an isolate within the Niger-Congo language family. In 1991, it was spoken by 200,000 people. So let's go back to the quote from the Jewish Encyclopedia. They called themselves Gullah, exiles, or B'nai Gullah, the children of exiles. And within the crucible of despair and hopelessness, they forged a new national identity and a new religion. Interesting how in the Niger-Congo family, you not only have the Gullah, but you have the Angolas and the Congolese. One of the most famous songs ever sung is the Negro spiritual that the Gullah people would sing on plantations, that Europeans would try to mimic, which they interpret as "come by here."
Kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya, kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya, kumbaya, my lord, kumbaya.
It became a standard campfire song for whites and tent revivals and summer camps. It enjoyed a broader popularity during the folk revival of the 1950s and 1960s. The problem is the song that whites would translate as "Come by here" is really "Kumbaya."
Kumbaya, 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 kumbaya. Come by here, y'all. In a time of darkness, the world is heartless. Missing kids on carton. Who would have thought this? Come by here, y'all. You are in control. You got the nations on hold. The wicked must.
What does that mean, you ask? Well, Yah is the abbreviated name of the God of the Bible, Yahuwah. The song is not "Come by here," but "Come here, Yah," a plea for deliverance from the captors. Hebrew words and traditions are not only found in the language and culture of the Gullah people of South Carolina and Georgia, but also throughout the African diaspora. Even the very names of slaves prior to the changing that took place at purchase had Hebrew origin. The Hebrew people will often surname themselves after the God that they serve. This is how we got names like Jeremiah, Nehemiah, Saraiah, Yekoniah, Hezekiah, etc., all naming themselves after Yah. If you ever took the time to scroll through the slave ledgers,
I keep my eye on heaven, I keep my eye on y'all. Me and the devil will always be at odds. And I left all that money in the streets, knowing that his blessing will increase if I obey. In the belly of the beast, 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 in the belly of the beast. I keep my eye on heaven, I keep my eye on y'all. Me and the devil will always be at odds. And I left all that money in the streets, knowing that his blessing will increase if I obey. In the belly of the beast, 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 in the belly of the beast. Yeah. From the darkness to the marvelous light, I stand. Chosen people called to be an archetype of the Lamb. Blood of Abraham through Christ, we got rights to the land. Grace through faith, I'm holy as DNA on my hand. If I'm in sin, I must repent. I gotta spin like a fan. We're from the fence to the bench, and now that pitch in the stands. That's home run. We're running home for like I'm running this sand. The world.
if you're not familiar with the Elohim of the Hebrews, maybe this script will help you. Psalm 68:4. Sing to Elohim, sing praises unto his name. Extol him that rideth upon the heavens by his name, Yah, and rejoice before him. See, not only will you find indigenous Hebrew names in the slave trade database, aka names are rather Yah or El as a prefix or suffix, you will even find the pronunciation of the name Yah hidden in some of the names of the countries where people will take it from, like Kenya, Algeria, Libya, Eritrea, Tunisia, Zambia, Namibia, Gambia, etc. Even the territory of South Africa, before Europeans dubbed it South Africa, was called in ancient times Azania. So how is that relevant? Well, the name is actually in the Bible. The name Azania, according to the Smith Bible Dictionary, means Azania, whom the Lord hears.
They were welcomed. And so from George Washington's administration on, there was questions of what do we do about the problem of the Florida Everglades. In 1818, this was James Monroe's administration, General Andrew Jackson actually moved into Florida, invaded it, not authorized to do so. He was actually pursuing justice against those who'd attacked Fort Scott in Georgia, but he did it anyway. He went into Florida and claimed it for the United States. When he seized the peninsula, he took the opportunity to execute some of the people who opposed him and also to clean out some of the areas of former slaves and Seminoles because he felt that this would make it better for annexation. The United States then soon actually bought Florida from the Spanish. When Jackson became president, he decided to make sure that the black Seminole communities were moved out by force. So he pursued this in his policy, his larger policy of Indian removal. This led to the Second Seminole War, which was 1835 to 1842, and became the largest and costliest of the so-called Indian Wars. Because the two communities were tied together, that is, the former slaves and the Seminoles, when the Seminoles were attacked in the Seminole War, this led to an uprising of the former slaves. In April of 1836, black Seminoles and their Indian allies moved together to create what was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. This wasn't just a matter of runaway slaves. More than 385 plantation slaves ran away from their masters and joined the black Seminoles, essentially in laying waste to the Florida sugar mills, which were some of the most valuable areas, plantations in the whole continent. One Seminole leader at the time was the leader Osceola, who is justly remembered by history. Another leader who rose up at this time was John Horse, who was ethnically a black Seminole, and who would ultimately lead his people on a long and trying exodus for their freedom. In 1838, John Horse and the black Seminoles agreed to stop fighting the U.S. government in exchange for moving to what was then considered to be Indian Territory, which is now today the state of Oklahoma, and for legal recognition of their freedom. So despite the fact many of them were runaway slaves, they would have the opportunity to start over again as free individuals. Once they moved...
If I thought that I'd ever be a slave again, I'd end it all right away. Because you're nothing but a dog. You're not a thing but a dog. Night never comes out. You have nothing to do. Time to cut tobacco. If they want you to cut all night long out in the field, you cut. And if they want you to hang all night long, you hang tobacco. It didn't matter about your tired, being tired, you're afraid to say you're tired. They just, well,